Adrian Moretti didn't come home that night, smelling like the office. He came home smelling like her another woman's perfume ground into his collar, his shirt untucked on the left side only, the specific carelessness of a man who stopped pretending somewhere around the third month. He walked past his 33-week pregnant wife without touching her, walked past the dinner she hadn't made because she'd stopped making it 2 weeks ago when she realized he wasn't coming home to eat it, walked straight to his study, closed the door, and actually laughed into his phone at something the woman on the other end said. Elara Moretti sat at the marble kitchen island and listened to her husband laugh. Her hand rested on her stomach. Noah kicked. She picked up the silver pen, and she began to read the divorce papers she had spent the last 31 days preparing. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible in your own home, if you've ever sat in a quiet room and realized the person you trusted most had been lying to your face for longer than you want to count, stay with me. Because what Elara did next took more courage than anything Adrian Moretti had ever demanded from the men who feared him. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories about real strength, real betrayal, and the kind of justice that doesn't always come with headlines. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels, and if Elara's courage moves you even a little, that like button is right there. Don't be shy now. Let's talk about how a pregnant woman dismantled a mafia empire with a silver pen and 31 days of silence. The first thing you need to understand about Elara is that she was not a woman who made decisions quickly. She had grown up the only daughter of a civil engineer father and a mother who ran the household accounts with the kind of precision that looked like magic from the outside and felt like mathematics from within. Her mother used to say, "A woman who understands where the money goes understands where the power is," and Elara had filed that away at age 12 and never quite let it go. She had a master's degree in financial law. She had passed her bar exam on the first attempt. She had taken a senior compliance role at a mid-sized firm before she married Adrian, and she had left that role her own decision, she told herself, and she believed it for a while, when the demands of being a Moretti wife made the hours impossible. She was not naive. That was the part that kept her awake in the early weeks, before the evidence became undeniable. She had genuinely believed herself too careful, too educated, too attentive to have missed something this large. She had watched the men around Adrian with appropriate wariness. She had never been fooled by the social warmth of people who smiled at her during company dinners. She had missed it because she trusted him, not completely, not stupidly, but enough. Enough to not look where she should have been looking. And by the time she started looking, 31 days before the night, Adrian walked past her without touching her and laughed into his study phone. What she found was so much worse than a name in a contact list or a hotel receipt left in a jacket pocket. It started with a number. Elara had access to the family's general operating accounts, a standard arrangement for the Moretti household, the kind of financial visibility that looked like trust from the outside. She wasn't supposed to touch the legacy trust. Nobody touched the legacy trust without Alina Voss, the independent attorney who had overseen its structure since Adrian's grandfather established it. The trust was sacred in the Moretti family, in the way that old money families treated certain things as sacred not out of genuine reverence, but out of the practical understanding that touching it drew attention. But Elara wasn't trying to touch it. She was looking at a different account, a household discretionary fund, when she saw a transfer reference she didn't recognize. The amount wasn't alarming. $42,000. The kind of number that could be explained a dozen ways. A property repair, a tax obligation, a business expense run through the wrong channel. She almost moved past it. She didn't, because the reference code was one she recognized from trust documentation she had reviewed 18 months earlier when she was first added to the beneficiary notifications as Adrian's wife. She had a good memory for numbers. It was, in her mother's words, her most useful talent. She sat with it for 3 days before she pulled the trust document from the encrypted filing system she maintained for the household's legal records. She read it again, compared the reference code, cross-checked the authorization structure. The $42,000 had moved through a channel that required legacy trust authorization to initiate, which meant either the reference code was being misused in error, possible but unlikely, or someone with trust access was routing money through the household discretionary account to obscure its origin. Elara closed the document, made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen island for 40 minutes watching the harbor. Then she started digging. She was careful. She had enough legal training to know that anything she found through improper access would be useless. She stayed within the boundaries of what she was authorized to see. She compiled questions rather than conclusions. She noted anomalies without reaching for explanations. By day 8, she had 17 anomalies. By day 15, she had a pattern. Day 22, she understood enough to feel the specific cold that settles in when the thing you feared turns out to be smaller than the thing you actually found. The affair she had suspected for 6 weeks. The signs were ordinary: a husband who stopped initiating conversation, whose phone developed a new habit of facing down on every surface, who began explaining his schedule with slightly too much precision. She had not confronted him because she wasn't certain, and Elara did not make accusations without certainty. But the money. The money was not an affair. The money was a conspiracy. Protected family trust assets funds that were legally tied to the interests of Moretti family members, including their unborn child, had been flowing, slowly and carefully, into a series of accounts that traced back to a woman named Sienna Ricci. Luxury apartment in the Back Bay. Private travel bookings between Boston and Milan. Jewelry purchases at 3 different firms. The careful, layered spending of someone who had been told the money would keep coming. And more than that, more than any of it, there was an $8 million transfer scheduled 41 days out from the Moretti Legacy Trust into a holding company registered in Sienna Ricci's name. Elara had run the holding company's registration. She had traced its listed business partnerships. And she had found, buried under 2 layers of corporate documentation, the name Victor Revel. She knew who Victor Revel was. Everyone in Adrian's world knew who Victor Revel was, even the people who were supposed to not know, even the wives who were supposed to look at their harbor views and not ask questions. Revel was the kind of man who built his operation on the ruins of other men's mistakes. He had been circling Eastport Terminal, the Moretti family's most profitable legitimate asset, a shipping facility that employed more than 1,800 workers for 3 years. The $8 million was not a gift to a mistress. It was a weapon aimed at Eastport, and it was scheduled to fire in 41 days. Elara sat with this knowledge for 4 more days. Not because she was frightened into paralysis, though she was frightened, in a particular way that has nothing to do with personal safety, and everything to do with the sudden understanding that the ground you thought was solid has been hollow for a long time. She sat with it because she needed to be certain of what she was going to do before she moved. A woman in her position, pregnant and married to the man she was about to dismantle, had exactly one opportunity to get this right. There would be no second approach. She used those 4 days to write down everything she knew, everything she could prove, and everything she still needed. She organized it the way she had organized case files at her old firm, clean-numbered, cross-referenced. She identified the gaps. She thought about who could fill them. There were 2 people she needed. Matteo Moretti first. Not because she trusted him completely. She didn't. Matteo was not a man who had built his family's empire by being trustworthy in the way that word usually means. He was trustworthy in the way that mattered to him, loyal to the Moretti name above individual Morettis, protective of the institution, even when the institution's members behaved like fools. She needed him because he still controlled enough of the family's internal structure to block Adrian without triggering an open war. And she needed him to understand what Adrian was about to do, not to the family's reputation, but to the family's money, and to the 1,800 workers who had spent their careers inside an operation the Morettis had always, at minimum, kept functioning. Alina Voss second, because without Alina, none of it meant anything. The trust was Alina's domain. The trustees answered to Alina's oversight. If the $8 million was going to be stopped, it had to be stopped through the trust's legal structure, not through anything that looked like a family power grab. Adrian's lawyers would destroy a family power grab. They couldn't touch a legal finding of fiduciary breach. She called Alina on a Thursday morning, from the parking garage of a medical building 3 blocks from the penthouse, using a phone she had purchased with cash 10 days earlier. Alina picked up on the second ring. "I have a compliance concern related to the Legacy Trust," Elara said. "I need 40 minutes of your time, off the record, until we determine the appropriate next steps. I am not making accusations. I am presenting anomalies." There was a pause. "Where?" Alina asked. They met in a conference room at Alina's firm the following morning. Elara brought printed copies of everything: the reference codes, the account traces, the holding company registration, the Revel connection, and the transfer schedule. She presented it the way she used to present compliance findings. Facts first, implications second, Question she couldn't answer third. Alina was quiet for a long time when Elara finished. You're certain about the registration trace? I'm certain about what the documents show. I'm not certain about intent. That's why I'm here. Alina looked at the transfer schedule. 41 days. 39 now. If the trustees acted on a suspected fiduciary breach, they could freeze the authorization before the transfer clears. Alina tapped the schedule. But we need documented evidence of intent, not just anomalies. We need something that shows Adrian knew the money was protected and moved it anyway, with knowledge of the harm. I know. Elara. Alina set down the papers. Your son is already listed as a beneficiary in the current trust structure. If Adrian knowingly moved assets against Noah's future interests, the trustees don't just have grounds to freeze the transfer. They have grounds to remove him from operational control entirely. Elara had known this. She had known it since day 22. But hearing it said out loud in a conference room by the attorney who had the actual power to make it happen, that was different. I know, she said again. She met with Matteo that same afternoon. She had expected resistance. Matteo was 81 years old and had spent 6 decades protecting the Moretti name from exactly the kind of exposure Elara was now proposing. She had prepared for a long argument, for deflection, for the particular brand of patriarchal dismissal that men like Matteo deployed when women brought them problems they hadn't asked to receive. Instead, Matteo sat very still through the entire presentation. When she finished, he said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then, how long have you known? 32 days. You sat on this for 32 days. I sat on it until I was certain enough to bring it to the right people first. Matteo looked at her across his desk. His expression was not warm. Matteo's expressions were rarely warm, but there was something in it she hadn't expected, something that looked uncomfortably like relief. What do you need from me? He asked. Stay out of the way until I tell you it's time, and then be exactly where I need you to be, he agreed. She didn't trust his agreement completely. She built contingencies around it. That was the kind of woman Elara Vale had always been, and pregnancy had not changed her. What came next was the hardest part. Not the evidence gathering. Not the legal strategy. Not even the physical reality of being 33 weeks pregnant and moving through the most concentrated, sustained stress of her adult life while her body continued the business of growing a human being. The hardest part was going home. Going home and being to every visible degree the woman Adrian expected to find there. Not submissive Adrian didn't want submissive. He wanted compliant, which is a different thing. He wanted a wife who occupied her appropriate space without inconvenience. He wanted the pregnancy to be proceeding, the household to be managed, and his personal life to remain, in his own estimation, quite separate from all of it. Elara gave him exactly that. For 3 days after her meetings with Alina and Matteo, she discussed nursery furniture with the calm interest of a woman whose primary occupation was preparing for her child's arrival. She attended her scheduled medical appointments. She asked Adrian, once, about a business trip he'd mentioned, and accepted his answer without follow-up. She watched his phone habits. She cataloged what he left on the kitchen counter versus what he kept in his jacket. She noted when he stepped out of rooms to take calls and how long he was gone. And she waited for Alina's forensic team to do their work. The team was quiet and thorough. Elara had given them everything she had. They pulled on the threads she'd identified and found more beneath them additional transfer routes, a secondary holding structure she hadn't traced, and a communications record that established a timeline of contact between Adrian and someone at Ravel's organization going back 14 months. 14 months. Noah had been conceived 11 months ago. The conspiracy predated her pregnancy. Adrian had been building this exit because that was what it was. She understood now. An exit from the Moretti family's legitimate operations and into whatever future he'd been constructing with Sienna Drici and Victor Ravel, while she had been believing, in her careful, non-naive way, that their marriage was difficult but functional. She processed this information in the hospital parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon while waiting for a prenatal appointment. She gave herself 8 minutes. Then she went inside and let the doctor measure Noah's growth and listened to his heartbeat and answered questions about her stress levels with the composed honesty of a woman who had decided exactly how much truth was useful in any given room. Mild work-related stress, she said, nothing I can't manage. The doctor noted it and moved on. That same evening, she came home to find a package on the kitchen counter. The return address was a boutique on Newbury Street. She didn't recognize the sender name. She opened it because it was addressed to her. Inside was a maternity dress, expensive, The kind of thing you'd select for a woman in her third trimester if you'd researched her size but didn't know her taste. The fabric was technically beautiful. The color was wrong. There was a card. It was unsigned. The handwriting was precise and slanted slightly left. Enjoy the penthouse while it lasts. Some of us have been patient long enough. Elara read it twice. Then she photographed the card, the dress, and the packaging. She placed everything in a Ziploc bag she retrieved from the kitchen drawer. She labeled it with the date and time in her own handwriting. She added it to her file. The dress had been sent to Siena Ricci. She was certain of this within 2 hours, after a search of the boutique's social accounts turned up an event photo in which a woman matching Siena's description was tagged 3 months prior. The handwriting matched a signature on a document Elara had found during her financial investigation, a lease agreement co-signed for the Back Bay apartment. What interested Elara was not the malice of the gesture. She had expected malice from Siena Ricci in the abstract. What interested her was the timing. The dress arrived 2 days after she had met with Alina, 3 days after she had met with Matteo. Either the timing was coincidence, or Siena Ricci was feeling pressure from somewhere. Elara didn't like coincidences. She updated Alina that same night. 2 days later, she was sitting in the penthouse living room with a book open in her lap, not reading, but maintaining the appearance of reading, which she had gotten very good at when Adrian's phone lit up on the coffee table. He had set it face down as always, but it had shifted when he stood up quickly to take a call in the kitchen, and it had come to rest face up at an angle she hadn't expected. She could see the screen from 4 feet away. The message was brief. Once the wife is gone, move the rest before your father notices. She read it once, looked away, counted to 5, picked up her book and turned a page. She did not photograph it. In that moment, Adrian was back in the kitchen, 20 feet away, and any movement toward his phone would be visible. She sat with it instead, printing it into her memory the way she had trained herself to process information that couldn't be immediately documented. Later, she wrote it down verbatim in the encrypted notes she kept on her second phone. Once the wife is gone, move the rest before your father notices. The wife. Not by name, not as a person. The wife. An obstacle. A category of inconvenience to be removed on a schedule. She had known this intellectually for weeks. Reading it in someone else's casual shorthand was a different experience. She sat with the difference for about 40 seconds before filing it away under things that were true and therefore useful. She did not have the luxury of grief right now. She would have it later, she told herself. She intended to keep that promise to herself. The next piece came through Alina's team rather than through direct observation. A communication record traced from the secondary holding structure showed a meeting scheduled between Adrian and someone listed under an obvious alias, a name that appeared in no other business context and had been added to a private calendar entry, using authentication credentials belonging to Adrian's personal assistant. The meeting location was listed as a residential address in the South End. Elara recognized the address. It was the apartment building where Siena Ricci lived. She went the following afternoon. She was careful. She did not approach the building directly. She knew the service entrance configuration because she had looked up the building's management company and pulled its public maintenance filings, which included an architectural overview used in a permit application. The service corridor on the building's east side was accessible from a side street and gave access to the building's lower maintenance level, from which a stairwell connected to the residential floors. She told herself this was reckless. She knew it was necessary. She arrived 40 minutes before the calendar entry's listed time. She found a position in the service corridor near the stairwell access where she could hear clearly without being visible. She stood there for 37 minutes, in the particular physical discomfort of late pregnancy, on her feet in a concrete corridor, with Noah's weight redistributing itself every time she shifted her stance. She heard Adrian arrive. She heard a second voice shortly after. Male, not Adrian. The voice had a specific cadence she had heard before. In recordings she had reviewed during her research, a deliberate, unhurried rhythm that belonged to a man who had learned that speaking slowly made other people nervous. Victor Ravel. She pressed record on her phone. She listened for the next 22 minutes. What she heard was not theater. It was not bluster or criminal posturing. It was two men discussing a business plan in the practical language of people who had worked out the details and were reviewing execution timelines. Ravel laid out the mechanism the $8 million would flow through Siena's holding company into a debt instrument that Ravel's organization had constructed around Eastport's financing structure. The instrument would trigger an artificial payment default. Eastport's creditors, who had been quietly influenced over the preceding months, would accelerate their claims. The terminal would enter a distressed asset process. Ravel's acquisition vehicle was already positioned to purchase it at a fraction of assessed value. Adrian asked about the workers, not out of concern. He asked because he wanted to know how long the transition period would take and whether labor disputes would complicate his personal extraction from the business. Ravel said 18 months, and the labor situation would be managed. Adrian said fine. Elara stopped recording after those 2 words. She stood in the concrete corridor for another 3 minutes without moving. Noah was very still. She was grateful for that. Then she walked out of the service corridor and back to the car she had parked 2 streets over, and she drove to a parking garage, and she sat there for a while, with her hands in her lap, not shaking. She had what she needed. She had, as of that afternoon, documentary and recorded evidence sufficient for Alina to take to the trustees. She had the financial trace establishing misuse of protected assets. She had the communication record establishing advanced knowledge and intent. She had the recording establishing the planned mechanism, and Adrian's explicit agreement. She had enough to destroy him. What she did not yet have was the one thing she had decided she needed above all the rest. She needed Adrian to destroy himself, not because she was cruel. She had examined that motivation carefully, the way she examined all her motivations, looking for the places where pain had dressed itself up as strategy. She was angry. She was allowed to be angry. But the anger was not driving the decision. The decision was practical. If Elara brought the evidence to the trustees and to law enforcement through external channels, Adrian would fight it. He would use the considerable resources still available to him to delay, to obscure, to reframe. His lawyers were very good. The case would be long, expensive, and uncertain. More importantly, during that process, the $8 million could still move. Calendar events could be canceled, schedules accelerated, authorization sequences completed before any freeze could be established. But if Adrian acted, if he voluntarily executed the final steps in his own conspiracy, believing he was winning, then the trustees would have undeniable documentation of intent, executed by his own hand. He needed to believe, at the moment he completed the transfer authorization, that he had already gotten away with it. And the only way to make Adrian Moretti believe that was to give him something he wanted, more than anything he thought he was losing. She had been thinking about the divorce papers for 3 weeks. She'd had them drafted by a private attorney in Cambridge, who specialized in high-asset dissolution and had a reputation for discretion that Elara had verified through 3 separate references. She had reviewed every line. She had not asked for anything that would alarm Adrian, no claim on the business operations, no challenge to the trust's existing structure, nothing that would read as an attack. She had asked for what she was legally entitled to as the mother of a Moretti child, standard parental protections for Noah, appropriate financial support, and a clean separation. It would look to Adrian like a woman who had decided she'd had enough but was too tired and too pregnant to fight. It would look like surrender. She came home from Alina's office the evening after the parking garage and found Adrian in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she came in. "How was the appointment?" he asked. He meant the prenatal appointment she had been scheduled for. That afternoon, she had not corrected his understanding of where she'd been. "Fine," she said. "Noah's growing. Good." He looked back at his phone. She set her bag down on the kitchen island. She reached inside. She placed the divorce papers on the marble surface between them. Adrian looked up slowly. She had not planned a speech. She had considered one. She was good with words, and there were things she wanted him to understand before this was over. But she had ultimately decided against it. Speeches were for people who needed to be convinced. Adrian needed to be maneuvered. "I think we both know where we are," she said. He looked at the papers. His expression moved through several stages in about 4 seconds: surprise, then suspicion, then a rapid recalculation she could almost watch happening behind his eyes. "Elara, I'm not asking you to explain anything." She kept her voice level. Not cold, not angry. Level, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm 33 weeks pregnant, and I'm tired, and I think we've been making each other miserable for longer than we've admitted. That's not, I want a clean separation. I want what Noah is owed. I'm not interested in your business or your assets or anything that isn't directly relevant to our child." She slid the pen across the marble toward him. "You wanted freedom, Adrian? Take it." The silence lasted long enough that she heard the harbor through the window. He picked up the pen. She watched his face. She had known Adrian Moretti for 4 years and had spent the last 31 days studying him with an attention she had never previously applied. She knew the specific microexpression that appeared when he was running calculations, a slight tension at the outer corners of his eyes, a slowing of his breathing. She watched him run them now. He was thinking, this is too easy. Then he was thinking, she has someone else. Then he was thinking, if she's out, the path is clear. She watched him arrive at the third thought and stopped there. He signed the papers. He signed them with the particular decisiveness of a man who has just convinced himself he has outmaneuvered someone. I'll have my attorney's review for the formal filing, he said, as if he were doing her a courtesy. Of course, she said. She picked up the papers. She picked up the pen. She put both in her bag. Get some sleep, he said, already moving toward his study. She watched him go. She stood at the kitchen island. For another moment, one hand resting on the marble, looking at the harbor through the glass. Then she took out her second phone and sent a single message to Alina. He signed. Phase 2. She set the phone down and looked out at the water for a while longer. Noah moved against her ribs, a slow rolling shift, the kind that usually came when he was settling. Not yet, she said quietly, to both of them. She had dismantled the marriage. Now she had to wait for Adrian to finish dismantling himself. She didn't know, couldn't know yet that he would do it faster than she had planned, or that he would do it the same night, or that the black authentication key he had never mentioned to anyone in the family would become the instrument of everything that followed. She only knew that she had 38 days before the transfer was scheduled, and she had already done the hardest thing. She had looked at a man she had once loved and decided that his freedom wasn't worth her son's future. She had handed him the pen, and he had taken it. Adrian Moretti celebrated the way. He celebrated everything quietly, expensively, and with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just removed an inconvenience from his schedule. He called Sienna from his study at 11:17 that night. Elara knew the time because she was still awake, sitting in the bedroom with the door closed and her second phone in her lap, and the particular quality of his voice carried through the wall in a way that the content of his words didn't. She didn't need the words. The tone told her everything. He was relaxed in a way he hadn't been in weeks. The tension that had lived in his shoulders every time he entered a room she occupied had dissolved the moment he signed those papers. He thought he was free. She listened to the cadence of his voice through the wall for about 4 minutes. Then she put in earbuds, pulled up the financial documents Alina had sent that afternoon, and spent the next 2 hours reviewing the forensic team's updated findings. She slept 4 hours. In the morning, Adrian was gone before she woke up. He had not left a note. He had not told her where he was going. He had not, in recent memory, done either of those things, but there was a new quality to the absence now, a lightness in the empty penthouse that told her he had left without the careful performance of a man maintaining a cover. He was already behaving like a man whose domestic obligations had been concluded. She showered, she ate. She called her obstetrician's office and confirmed next week's appointment. Then she called Alina. He'll move within 72 hours, she said without preamble. He signed last night. He was on the phone with Sienna by 11. He thinks the path is clear. Alina was quiet for a moment. In the background, Elara could hear the sound of papers being shifted. The forensic team flagged something this morning. There's a secondary authorization mechanism we hadn't identified in the initial review. A physical authentication key hardware, not digital. The kind that generates one-time codes for high-value trust transactions. Elara had not known about the key. She didn't let that show in her voice. What does it authorize? Transactions above $5 million from the Legacy Trust's primary reserve account. It was issued to Adrian 18 months ago when the trust structure was updated. There's no record of Matteo being informed of the issuance, because Adrian arranged it himself. That's the implication. Elara stood at the kitchen window. The harbor was flat and gray under the morning overcast. A container ship was moving slowly toward the channel mouth, its outline patient and enormous. Can you freeze the reserve account without triggering Adrian's legal team before we have everything in place? Not without a formal trustee motion. And a formal motion requires 48 hours notice to all named parties, which includes Adrian. So he'd know we were moving. Yes, then we can't freeze it first. Elara turned away from the window. We need him to complete the authorization himself, on record after the divorce is finalized. That establishes the final proof of intent. That's a significant risk, Elara. If he completes the authorization before we can act, he won't complete the transaction. He'll complete the authorization sequence. Those are different steps. The transaction itself requires a second clearance through the trust's banking intermediary, and that clearance has a 12-hour processing window. She had read the trust documentation 4 times. She knew its mechanics better than Adrian did. We intercept at the banking stage, not the authorization stage. By the time he thinks the money is moving, we already have documented evidence of intentional misuse of protected assets. Another pause. You've thought about this for a while, Alina said. I've had time. She spent the rest of that day at the apartment of her college friend, Petra, who knew nothing about the Moretti family's internal finances and everything about Elara's personal history, and who had the useful quality of asking direct questions and accepting direct answers without embellishment. Elara had been meeting Petra at her apartment on Tremont Street once a week for the past month, ostensibly for the kind of low-key social contact her obstetrician had suggested as good for third trimester stress management. Actually, she needed somewhere to sit that wasn't the penthouse, and she needed someone who would look at her like a human being, rather than a liability or a variable. Petra made coffee Elara didn't drink, and herbal tea Elara accepted and set a plate of crackers between them without comment. You look like you haven't slept, Petra said. 4 hours. Is it him or the baby? Both, neither. I don't know. Elara picked up a cracker and set it down without eating it. I know what I'm doing. I know it's the right thing. There's a part of this that I didn't account for. What part? The part where you realize you spent 4 years being genuinely wrong about someone. Not just wrong about one thing. Wrong about what they were, underneath everything else. She looked at the table. I knew he was difficult. I knew the family has a particular way of operating that I understood when I married him. I didn't know he was this. Petra was quiet. I keep thinking about when Noah was confirmed at the 20-week scan, Elara said. Adrian was there. He looked at the screen, and his face he was genuinely moved. I saw it. I know what I saw. People can be genuinely moved and still be what they are. I know, it doesn't make it less true. The scan. His face. I know that too. Petra refilled her tea without being asked. You don't have to be okay, Petra said. You just have to keep moving. That's exactly what I'm doing. Elara finally ate the cracker. That's all I'm doing. She was back at the penthouse by 4. Adrian had returned at some point. His jacket was on the chair near the elevator, which was where he always left it, when he came home quickly and planned to go out again. His briefcase was gone. His keys were gone. She checked the kitchen counter. His personal phone was face down beside the espresso machine. He had left without it. She stood very still for a moment. He never left without his personal phone. He had the business line, which he rarely left unattended, and the personal line, which functioned as his actual communication channel for anything he didn't want traced to the business. Leaving the personal phone at home was either carelessness or deliberate. A man who had just signed divorce papers and considered himself free might be careless. A man who was about to do something he didn't want tracked might leave the phone that tracked him. She photographed the phone on the counter. She didn't touch it. She texted Alina. He left the personal phone home. Something is moving today. Alina responded in under 2 minutes. Forensic team is monitoring. I'll call you when we have something. The call came at 7:40 that evening. Elara was in the nursery, which she had been assembling in stages over the past 3 weeks, not because she found it soothing exactly, but because it was something concrete to do with her hands during the hours when thinking was counterproductive. The crib was assembled. The dresser was not. She was sitting on the floor with the dresser instructions spread around her, sorting hardware into small groups by size, when the phone rang. He met with Ravel, Alina said. Elara set down a bolt. When? This afternoon. The location was a property on the waterfront, not the South End address. A different one. Our team picked it up through the secondary communications trace. Alina's voice had a controlled quality that Elara recognized as the sound of a person managing alarm. There was a financial instrument executed at the meeting. We believe Ravel's legal structure accepted a preliminary commitment document, not the $8 million itself, but a binding letter of intent that represents a formal step toward the transaction. Adrian signed a LOI with Ravel, we believe so. That's intent. That's documented, formal, legally actionable intent. Yes. But there's more, a beat. Ravel's team has been in contact with 3 of Eastport's primary creditors. The communications are structured to look like routine relationship management, but the pattern matches what you'd expect if someone's preparing those creditors to accelerate claims on a coordinated schedule. Elara pressed the phone against her ear and looked at the half-sorted hardware on the nursery floor. 1,800 workers. She had been keeping that number somewhere specific in her mind, not as an abstraction, not as a talking point for the trustees, but as an actual fact with actual weight. The Moretti family had a complicated history, and Elara was not naive about what it meant to be married into it. But Eastport was legitimate. It had been legitimate for decades. The people who worked there, the crane operators, the mechanics, the dispatchers, the people who drove their kids to school in the morning and came home smelling like machinery and harbor water. In the evening, they had nothing to do with the Moretti family's other operations. They had built their livelihoods inside a company that happened to belong to people who were not always what they appeared. And Adrian was willing to hand it to Victor Revel. "How long before the creditor situation becomes irreversible?" she asked. "Alina's team thinks 3 weeks, maybe 4. If Revel's people complete their positioning with the creditors before we can move, the trust's ability to protect Eastport through legal channels becomes significantly more complicated. We move within the week then. The divorce will be formally filed in 2 days. The moment it's filed, Adrian loses any claim to act on my behalf in a legal proceeding. He'll also lose whatever access he thinks my continued presence in the household has given him." She started picking up the hardware from the floor, setting it back in the bag without sorting it. She'd sort it later. He'll want to finalize things quickly. He'll use the authentication key within 48 hours of the filing. "You're certain?" He thinks he's already won. Winning men don't wait. She was right. The divorce filing was confirmed at 9 a.m. on Thursday morning. At 11:47 the same day, Alina's forensic team detected activation of the hardware authentication key. The key generated a one-time authorization code that was submitted to the Legacy Trust's banking intermediary. The code authorized a transfer of $8 million from the primary reserve account to the holding company, registered in Sienna Ricci's name. The transaction entered the banking intermediary's 12-hour processing window at 11:53 a.m. At 12:07 p.m., Alina filed an emergency trustee motion with documented evidence of fiduciary breach. At 12:44 p.m., 2 independent trustees confirmed the motion. At 1:15 p.m., the banking intermediary received a legal hold notice. The transaction was frozen at $92,000, processed a rounding error against the full $8 million. Elara received a text from Alina at 1:16. Frozen all of it. He used the key himself. "We have everything." She was sitting in Petra's kitchen when it came through. She read it twice, set the phone face down on the table, picked up her tea. Her hands were steady. She had known they would be. But it was still useful information to confirm it. Petra was watching her from across the table. "It's done," Elara said. "Which part?" "The part I was in control of." Petra understood without being told that there were other parts. She refilled the tea again and didn't ask about them. The parts Elara was not fully in control of began approximately 6 hours later. Adrian came home at 7:40 that evening. She heard the elevator before she heard him, the particular mechanical sound of it, reaching the penthouse floor, the doors opening, the specific rhythm of his footsteps that she had learned in 4 years of marriage, the way you learn anything you're exposed to daily, without meaning to. He came into the living room, and he looked at her, and she knew immediately that he knew something was wrong. Not everything, but something. His jaw had the tight set that appeared when his business instincts were firing, without his conscious mind having caught up to them yet. He was still wearing his coat. He had not stopped to take it off, which meant he had come directly here from wherever he had been, without the usual buffer of the study or the kitchen. The banking intermediary sent a notification, he said. She had expected this. The intermediary's automated system would have generated a hold notification to the account originator. "I know." He went very still. Sit down, Adrian. Tell me what you know." She set down the book she had been holding. She hadn't been reading it, but she'd held something in her hands and looked at him directly. "The transfer has been frozen by a trustee motion. The motion is supported by documentation of unauthorized use of protected trust assets. The trustees have been notified. An independent review process begins tomorrow morning." The color that left his face was specific, not the pallor of shock. The flat gray of a man who has just understood that a door he thought was open has been sealed behind him. "You did this. The trustees did this. On the basis of documented evidence of breach. You gave them." He stopped. Started again. "How long?" 35 days. Something crossed his face that she hadn't fully anticipated. Not rage she had planned for rage, had built contingencies around it. Something more complicated than rage. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the specific pain of a man who had underestimated someone he should have been paying attention to. The divorce papers, he said slowly. Yes. You had it ready. You had all of it ready before you came to me with the papers. I had what I needed. He moved suddenly toward the kitchen island, not toward her, but with enough force that she registered the movement before her mind had assessed the intent. He picked up his phone, the personal one, still on the counter where he'd left it that morning, and stared at the screen. She watched him without moving. He was calling someone. His attorney, she assumed. Possibly Ravel. She noted the call, the time, the expression on his face while he waited for an answer. The call didn't connect. He tried again. Still nothing. He set the phone down with a controlled movement that cost him something and turned back to her. Ravel, I don't know what Ravel's situation is at this moment, she said. This was technically true. She knew what Alina had told her, but she had not been personally informed of anything beyond the trust freeze. What I know is that the trust is frozen. The documentation is with the trustees, and the review begins tomorrow. You're going to destroy this family. The statement landed in the room, and she let it sit there for a moment before she answered. No, she said. I'm going to protect what belongs to Noah. Whatever you've done to this family, you did before tonight. Elara, I'm 33 weeks pregnant, Adrian. I'm tired. I want you to leave this apartment tonight and let me think without your presence in it. This is my leave. Or I call Matteo and put him on speaker, and we have the conversation we would have had 6 weeks ago if you'd made different choices. The mention of Matteo landed differently than she'd expected. Adrian's expression shifted not to anger, but to a sudden, focused attention, as if Matteo's name had triggered something specific that she hadn't fully accounted for. My father knows, he said. It wasn't a question. Matteo was informed of the compliance concerns through appropriate channels. The focused attention became something harder. How long has my father known? Long enough. Adrian said nothing for almost 30 seconds. He was looking at her, but she had the strong impression he wasn't seeing her. He was looking past her, running calculations about his father, about what Matteo's prior knowledge meant for the power structures he had assumed were intact. Then he picked up the coat he'd never taken off, and he left. She heard the elevator. She stood at the kitchen island and listened to the building settle around her after his departure. Then she went to the nursery and finished assembling the dresser. It took an hour and 40 minutes. She sorted the hardware properly this time and followed the instructions in sequence, and when it was done, she stood in the doorway and looked at the room that would belong to her son. It was a good room, small by Moretti standards, but that had always struck her as the right size for a child's first understanding of the world. She slept 5 hours. The next morning came fast and ugly. Matteo called at 7:15, before she had finished her first cup of tea, and his voice had the particular controlled quality of a man who has been awake since considerably earlier. He came to see me last night, Matteo said. I expected he would. He believes I orchestrated this with you. Did you tell him otherwise? I told him the truth, that you brought me the evidence, and I chose to act on it because my duty to the trust and to this family's future outweighs my duty to a son who chose to behave like a thief. The word thief sat in the air on the phone line between them. Elara hadn't heard Matteo use it before. She filed it. How did he respond, she asked. He threw a chair, a pause. My study chair. He's always had a poor relationship with furniture when he's angry. Despite everything, she felt something almost like the ghost of a wry response working at the corner of her mouth. She suppressed it. Is he going to be a problem before tomorrow morning's review? He's already being a problem. He called 3 trustees before midnight. 2 of them called me. Matteo's tone shifted, something tightening in it. Elara, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you considerably earlier. And I am aware of that, and I'm not going to insult you by suggesting I had good reasons for the delay. She set down her tea. There is a history with Sienna Ricci that predates what you found in the financial records. I was aware of the initial relationship. Not the financial aspect, I was not aware of that, and that is the truth. But I was aware that Adrian had been involved with Sienna for longer than you know. And I made a decision, several years ago, that I regret, which was to allow certain things to develop because I believed I could manage where they went. She was quiet. I used the situation as a test, Matteo said, to determine whether Adrian would make the decisions I needed him to make. I had concerns about his judgment regarding the business. I thought that his choices around Sienna would tell me what I needed to know about his choices around the family's assets. He stopped. When it became clear that the test had stopped being a test and had become something else, something that was affecting you directly, I should have acted. I didn't. I continued to watch and manage from a distance, and I told myself it was strategic when it was actually a form of cowardice. Elara's hand was flat on the kitchen counter. She could feel the cold of the marble against her palm. How long, she said. 3 years. You knew for 3 years. I knew about the relationship. Not the financial crime. Elara, the money, the Ravel connection. What he planned for Eastport. None of that was visible to me until you brought it. I want you to believe that because it's true. What I knew and concealed was the personal situation. And I understood that concealing it affected you. And I made a choice to prioritize the institution over the person. And I am telling you now because you deserve to know the full accounting before tomorrow. She stayed quiet for a long time. Noah moved inside her a slow, deliberate shift, the kind that felt like an elbow pressing outward, which her doctor had told her was normal, and which she had never fully gotten accustomed to. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. Her voice was even. She had made it even on purpose. Elara, we'll deal with what your disclosure means for the trustee structure after the review is complete. I need to think about it clearly, and I can't do that right now. Of course. One more thing. She picked up her tea. It was cold. Matteo, if you ever again make a decision to manage a situation that involves my life and my child's future without informing me, I will not give you the courtesy of a private conversation before I act. Are we understood? A long pause. Yes, he said, we are. She ended the call. She stood at the kitchen counter. For another moment, the cold tea in her hand, looking at the harbor. Matteo had known. Not everything. Not the crime. But the foundation of it, the relationship, the years of it, the careful cultivation of a situation he thought he could direct that he had known, and sat on and watched develop while she moved through her marriage in the particular blindness of a woman who trusted that the people surrounding her were operating in good faith. The anger was clean and specific. She let it move through her without suppressing it, because suppressing it wasn't useful, and she had stopped doing things that weren't useful. Then she filed it. There would be a reckoning with Matteo's role. Not today. Today had its own demands. The trustee review board convened at 9:15 the next morning in a conference room at Alina's firm. Elara was there. Matteo was there. The 3 independent trustees were there. David Chen, the operating chief of Eastport Terminal, had been contacted the night before and was present by phone. His voice carrying through the conference room speaker with the careful composure of a man who had been told his life's work was in danger and had spent the intervening hours getting himself ready to fight for it. Adrian arrived 12 minutes late. He came in without his attorney. His attorney, Elara learned later, had declined to attend after reviewing the documentation overnight and determining that the legal position Adrian occupied did not benefit from formal representation in a preliminary trustee proceeding. That calculation told her something about the attorney's assessment of the evidence. Adrian looked at the room when he entered. He looked at Matteo. He looked at Alina. He looked at the 3 trustees, whose faces were arranged in the neutral expressions of people who had reviewed documentation they found very troubling and were being professionally careful about what they showed. He looked at Elara last. She met his eyes without expression. He sat down. The review began. Alina presented the documentation in sequence: the financial trace, the transfer records, the holding company registration, the Ravel connection, the communication record establishing a 14-month timeline of planning, the letter of intent executed 2 days prior, the authentication key activation, and the frozen transaction. She presented the recording last. The 22 minutes of audio from the service corridor at Siena Cicci's building filled the conference room through the speaker system Alina's assistant had set up before anyone arrived. Adrian's voice and Ravel's voice were clear. The discussion of Eastport's artificial default was clear. The creditor manipulation strategy was clear. Adrian's question about the workers, the one that had told her everything she needed to know about what he valued and in what order, was clear. And his answer. Fine, single word, 1 syllable. The room was quiet when the recording ended. David Chen said, from the phone speaker, in a voice that was very controlled, 1,800 people. No one responded to him directly. No one needed to. The trustees asked Adrian 4 questions. His attorney had not prepared him for a proceeding without representation, and his answers showed it, not because he was inarticulate, but because the questions were structured to confirm documented facts rather than invite explanation, and confirming documented facts, in this context, was equivalent to confirming the breach. After the 4th answer, the 3 trustees conferred briefly among themselves in a side room. They returned in 11 minutes. The vote was unanimous. Adrian's operational authority was suspended, effective immediately, pending formal legal proceedings. The $8 million dollar transaction was permanently blocked. An independent administrator was appointed to oversee the trust's assets during the preceding period. David Chen was confirmed as sole operating authority at Eastport Terminal, and Elara Moretti was named as temporary protective representative for Noah's beneficial interest in the trust, a formal legal designation that gave her standing to participate in any subsequent proceedings affecting her son's inheritance. Adrian said nothing when the decision was read. He looked at the table. Then he looked at his father. Matteo met his son's eyes without looking away. Whatever passed between them in that moment, Elara didn't try to read. She was looking at the harbor through the conference room's window, the same harbor she looked at from the penthouse kitchen, the same water, different angle. A container ship was moving outbound through the channel, heavy and deliberate. She thought it's not over, because it wasn't. Victor Ravel was still out there with his creditor contacts and his acquisition vehicle, and his very detailed plan for dismantling an asset that 1,800 people had spent their careers building. The trust was frozen, but Ravel's external strategy didn't require the trust money to remain viable if he could accelerate the creditor situation fast enough. She thought Sienna still has access to Adrian. And Sienna, who had sent a cruel dress with a cruel note while Elara was 33 weeks pregnant, was not a woman who would gracefully accept the evaporation of everything she'd been promised. She thought the authentication key. Where was the physical key right now? She turned to Alina quietly while the trustees were filing out of the room. The authentication key. Do we have it in evidence? Alina frowned slightly. It should have been deactivated when we filed the trustee motion. Should have been, I'll confirm. Alina pulled out her phone and stepped toward the window. Elara watched her make the call, watched her expression as she listened to the response. Alina turned back with the specific careful stillness of someone managing the announcement of something she didn't want to announce. The deactivation was filed, Alina said quietly. But the banking intermediary's deactivation process requires manual confirmation from the key holder. If the key holder doesn't respond to the deactivation request within 24 hours, the key remains technically active. Adrian hasn't confirmed the deactivation. No, and the key is a physical object. Yes, they looked at each other. He left it at home this morning, Elara said. She knew this because she had watched him leave the penthouse at 7 a.m. through the hallway camera that she had installed 10 days ago, and that he had not found, and she had watched him take his wallet, his business phone, his coat, and his keys. She had not seen him take a small hardware device from the desk drawer, where she had observed him placing it twice in the past week, which meant the authentication key was currently sitting in the desk drawer of the Moretti penthouse study. And Adrian, who had just lost his operational authority in a formal trustee proceeding, was about to discover that his girlfriend had been sitting in that penthouse doing her own calculations for the past 12 hours because Sienna Ricci had a key to the penthouse. Elara had suspected this for 3 weeks and confirmed it 2 days ago when a building security log showed a fob entry at 3:17 a.m. on a night Adrian was supposed to be in New York. Elara's phone rang, building security. She answered it. Ms. Moretti. The guard's voice was measured, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that told her this was not a routine call. There is a woman in the penthouse. She entered approximately 40 minutes ago, using a registered fob. She has not left. We attempted contact through the unit intercom and she did not respond. Elara was already moving toward the conference room door. Don't approach the unit, she said. I'm on my way. She did not run. Running was not something she could do at 33 weeks, and it would not have helped her think more clearly. She walked quickly with the focused quality of someone who has just realized that the timeline she had been managing has accelerated without her permission, and that the physical authentication key sitting in the desk drawer of her penthouse was about to determine whether everything she had spent 35 days building would hold or come apart. She pushed through the conference room door into the hallway. Alina was right behind her. The elevator was waiting. And somewhere above them, in a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, a woman who had sent a cruel dress and signed her name to a future that no longer existed was standing in a study she didn't own, looking at a desk drawer she had no right to open, and the authentication key inside it was still active, and Victor Ravel's phone was almost certainly already ringing. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor took 47 seconds. Elara counted them. Not deliberately, she wasn't the kind of woman who counted elevator seconds as a coping mechanism, but her mind had shifted into a particular operational register that cataloged small facts automatically, the way it had been doing for 35 days, and 47 seconds was a fact. Alina was beside her. Neither of them spoke during the ascent. There was nothing useful to say in 47 seconds that hadn't already been communicated in the look they'd exchanged in the conference room hallway. The look that said, "We missed something, and now we're going to find out how much it costs us." The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt occupied rather than empty. The specific stillness of a space where someone is trying not to make sound. Elara stepped out of the elevator. Alina followed. The study door was partially open. She could see through the gap the edge of the desk. The lamp was on. The desk drawer, the second drawer on the right, where she had observed Adrian, placing the authentication key twice in the past week, was open. She pushed the study door. Sienna Ritchie was standing behind the desk with the authentication key in her hand. She was not what Elara had expected, and Elara was irritated with herself for having expectations at all. She had seen photographs social media, the boutique event photo, a professional headshot from a design consultancy Sienna had listed as her employer before the Back Bay apartment, and the private travel had apparently consumed most of her professional schedule. The photographs showed a carefully composed woman in her early 30s, attractive in a way that required visible effort. In person, Sienna looked like someone who had been awake since 2 in the morning, running a calculation that kept coming out wrong. Her makeup was intact, but there was a quality beneath it, a tightness around the jaw. A brightness in the eyes that ran a degree hotter than composure, that told Elara this woman had been managing fear for the past several hours, and was now managing the specific version of fear that sets in when you realize the plan you were promised has collapsed, and you are holding the one remaining piece of it in your hand. They looked at each other across the desk. "Put it down," Elara said. Sienna's hand tightened on the key. "He told me to get it. Adrian told you to come to my home and take something from my husband's desk. It's his desk. His home. His home that he no longer has authority to access, following a formal trustee suspension that was confirmed 40 minutes ago." Elara kept up her voice level. The leveling was costing her something. She could feel it in the muscles of her throat, a kind of sustained tension, but she paid the cost because losing her voice's steadiness right now would be useful to Sienna and useless to her. "You have entered this property without my permission, using a building access credential that was never authorized to be in your possession. You are currently holding a financial instrument that is the subject of an active legal proceeding. I am asking you once to put it down." Sienna looked at Alina, then back at Elara, then at the key in her hand, as if she were running a real-time assessment of what it was actually worth to her in this specific moment. "He said the key is still active," Sienna said. "He said if I bring it to him, he can still. He can't." Alina stepped forward. The deactivation request was filed at 9:17 this morning. The 24-hour window is a procedural requirement, not an operational window. Any transaction attempted with that key in the next 22 hours will be flagged, held, and added to the evidence package currently with the trustees. The only thing Adrian can do with that key right now is make his situation significantly worse. Sienna's jaw moved. She stopped. "He told you a lot of things," Elara said. "I suspect some of them were true at the time he said them. The apartment in the Back Bay, the travel, the future he described for the two of you." She moved to the side of the desk, not reaching for the key, not crowding Sienna's space, just shifting her position so she was no longer framed in the doorway, so the room felt less like a confrontation and more like a conversation. "I'm not here to talk to you about any of that. I don't have the energy for it, and it wouldn't help either of us. You ruined everything." The statement was so direct it landed almost cleanly, without the dramatic weight Sienna had probably intended. "No," Elara said. "Adrian ruined everything. I just documented it." Sienna set the key down on the desk. It was not a capitulation, not entirely. It was the movement of a woman who had just run her assessment and found that the math didn't support what she'd come here to do. She set the key down and took her hand away from it and looked at Elara with an expression that had shed most of its performance and showed something underneath that was just tired and angry and badly frightened. "What happens to me?" she asked. "That depends significantly on what you do in the next 48 hours, Alina said, "and on what you know about Victor Ravel's operations." Sienna's eyes moved to Alina at the name. Something shifted in them, not surprise, but a particular sharpening that Elara catalogued. "I want a lawyer," Sienna said. "That's the first intelligent thing you've said since we walked in," Elara replied. "I'd suggest you call one immediately." She picked up the authentication key from the desk. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a matte gray device about the size of a thick thumb drive, with a small digital display and a single button. The display was dark. She turned it over in her hand once, examining it with the same careful attention she gave every piece of evidence, and then she handed it to Alina. "Add it to the package," she said. Alina took it and stepped out of the study to make the call to the trustees. Elara was alone with Sienna. The silence between them was particular. Not hostile, exactly. More like the silence between two people who have been in the same story from opposite sides and are now occupying the same room for the first time and finding that the room is smaller than either of them expected. Sienna looked at Elara's stomach. The look was not cruel this time. It was something more complicated. "I didn't know about the child at the beginning," Sienna said. "When it started, he told me she stopped. It doesn't matter what he told me." "No," Elara agreed, "it doesn't. The dress I sent, I have it in evidence." Sienna looked at the window. "I'm not a good person. I'm not adjudicating that right now. I just want you to know I didn't." She pressed her lips together. "There's a limit to what I knew, what I agreed to." He kept things in sections. Ravel was a section I wasn't supposed to see. I knew there was a plan for the terminal. I didn't know the details of what it meant for the people who work there. Elara looked at her for a moment. She believed the statement partially. The partial belief was enough. "Then tell that to whoever represents you," she said, "and tell it accurately, because the documentation we have establishes your holding company as the transfer vehicle. Your cooperation is the difference between a civil matter and a federal one." She left Sienna in the study. Building security had sent 2 personnel to the foyer at Alina's direction. Elara spoke to them briefly, confirmed that Sienna would be leaving within the hour and should be escorted from the building, and then went to the kitchen and stood at the counter. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the sustained cost of the past hour, the elevator, the study, the particular effort of speaking to Sienna Sici with the controlled precision of a woman who had every right to rage and had chosen, very deliberately, not to. She ran cold water over her wrists. An old habit, her mother's recommendation, for moments when the body needed to be reminded it was still operating. The cold hit the pulse points and she breathed through it. Noah was quiet. She ate something crackers from the cabinet, the only thing she trusted her stomach to handle, and drank half a glass of water and waited for the shaking to stop. It stopped in about 4 minutes. She called Alina back into the kitchen. "The key is secured," Alina said. "Deactivation confirmation will be completed by end of day. I've already spoken to the trustees. They're adding the penthouse entry to the evidence record. Sienna's going to cooperate." "You think so?" She's frightened. And she's smart enough to understand that Ravel is going to let her absorb the criminal exposure for the holding company if she doesn't establish her own account first. Elara finished the water. "She'll cooperate. Maybe not today, but within the week. That would significantly help the federal case." "I know," she set down the glass. "What's Ravel doing right now?" "Specifically." Alina's expression shifted in the direction of something she was organizing before she said it. "The forensic team has been monitoring his communications network. There was significant activity this morning, after the trustee decision, before we secured the key. He was contacted by someone from Adrian's network. We don't know who yet. Adrian called someone before he left this morning. Possibly. The communication we detected went through a relay structure. We're still tracing it." Alina paused. "What I can tell you is that Ravel's acquisition vehicle filed a preliminary motion with Eastport's primary creditors at 11 this morning." Elara went still. "He moved without the 8 million. He's attempting to. The 8 million was his preferred mechanism, but his legal team apparently prepared a secondary approach that uses the creditor relationships he'd been building for the past 2 months. If 3 of Eastport's 5 primary creditors agree to accelerate their claims simultaneously, he can manufacture the default without the trust money. It would be slower, messier, more legally exposed." Alina met her eyes. "But yes, it could work." Elara sat down on the kitchen stool. The weight of the past several hours settled through her in a way she allowed, because she was alone with Alina and Alina had seen her be tired before and it wouldn't cost her anything. "How long do we have?" she asked. "The creditor acceleration process under Eastport's financing agreements requires a formal default notice. The earliest that could be filed is 10 days from now, assuming all 3 creditors move simultaneously. David Chen's team is already reviewing the agreements with independent counsel. 10 days, give or take. 10 days was not comfortable. 10 days was enough time for Ravel to do significant damage if he moved decisively, and what Elara had learned about Victor Ravel over the course of 35 days was that he moved decisively when he had no better option. She had removed his preferred option. He was now operating from a secondary position, which meant he was more dangerous, not less. Cornered strategies were unpredictable. I need to talk to David, she said. I'll set it up for this afternoon. And I need to understand Ravel's legal exposure, specifically what the trust decision means for his position with the creditors. If we can establish that the preliminary motion he filed this morning constitutes a continuation of the conspiracy that's already been documented, then the federal investigators who've been watching Ravel's operations for the past 2 years have grounds to accelerate their own timeline. Alina was nodding. I made a call this morning, before the trustee review. There are people who have been interested in Victor Ravel for considerably longer than we have. Elara looked at her. How long have you been in contact with them? Since the day you brought me the initial documentation. Alina held her gaze steadily. I'm not an investigator, Elara. I'm a trust attorney. The moment you showed me what you'd found, I had obligations that went beyond protecting the trust's assets. I should have told you I'd made that contact. I'm telling you now because you're going to need to know what they know, and they're going to need to know what you know, and the easiest way to accomplish that is to stop keeping sections. The word sections landed. Sienna had used it 20 minutes ago in the study. He kept things in sections, and now Alina. Everyone in this story had been keeping sections. What do they have? Elara asked. 18 months of communication records, financial traces through 3 jurisdictions, and a pattern of asset manipulation that matches what Ravel did to 2 other companies before Eastport. They've been waiting for a domestic evidence source, something originating inside the operation, rather than from external surveillance, to establish the conspiracy's reach. Alina set her phone on the counter between them. What you recorded in that service corridor is exactly what they needed. Elara looked at the phone. 22 minutes of audio. 2 voices in a concrete corridor. Fine, 1 syllable. They want to meet, she said. Yes. Set it up. The meeting happened that afternoon in a conference room at a federal building in Post Office Square, and Elara walked in at 3:15 with Alina beside her, and the specific composure of a woman who had been awake since before 6, and was currently operating at 33 and a half weeks pregnant, and had spent her morning recovering a financial instrument from a woman in her own home. And if the 2 federal agents on the other side of the table found any of that remarkable, they were professional enough not to show it. They were careful, methodical people with the organized quality of individuals who had built a case slowly over a long time and were now looking at someone who had arrived with a piece they'd been missing. They asked their questions in sequence. They took notes. They played the recording twice and asked her to confirm the context of each statement she could provide context for. She told them everything. Not because she trusted the process completely, she had enough legal training to understand federal investigations had their own priorities and their own timelines, and that her interests and their interests aligned, without being identical. But she told them everything, because it was the most effective available tool, and effectiveness was what she was operating on. After 2 hours, the lead agent, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and the kind of steady attention that came from years of listening to people describe things they'd rather not describe, set down her pen. You understand, the agent said, that when this moves forward, the domestic evidence you've provided will necessarily implicate your husband in the federal conspiracy as well as the civil trust violation. I understand. His exposure in a federal proceeding would be significantly more serious than the trust matter. I understand that too. The agent looked at her for a moment, not skeptically, with the particular attention of someone checking whether the person across the table has actually processed what they just said. He's your child's father, the agent said. He is. Elara met her eyes. And when my son is old enough to ask me why I made the choices I made, I'm going to tell him the truth. All of it. Including that I didn't protect his father from the consequences of his father's own choices. She kept her voice even. What I protected was his future, and 1,800 workers who had nothing to do with any of this. The agent nodded once. The meeting ended at 5:40. Elara sat in the federal building lobby for 10 minutes before she was ready to stand up and leave. Alina sat beside her without speaking, which was the right instinct. She was not devastated. She wanted to be honest with herself about that she was exhausted, and she was carrying a grief that had no clean edges, but she was not devastated. The decision had been made in the service corridor at Sienna Ricci's building, when she heard Adrian say fine to the destruction of 1,800 people's livelihoods. The decision had been confirmed in the past 3 hours. She was living with it clearly, and that was what she intended to keep doing. What she had not accounted for was what came next. Not the federal case. Not Ravel's accelerated creditor strategy. Not even Sienna's eventual cooperation. What she had not accounted for was Matteo. She received a call from him at 6:17 while she was in the car on the way back to the penthouse. His voice was different from the morning call. The morning call had carried the quality of a man managing a confession. This call carried something else, a tightness that she identified, after a moment, as fear. He came back, Matteo said. Adrian, he came to the house an hour ago. He's Elara. I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not something I was aware of until today. She waited. There is a second archive, Matteo said. A Moretti family record archive that has been maintained outside the trust structure for 30 years. I knew the archive existed. I did not know, or I told myself I didn't know, and I need to be honest with you about the difference between those two things. I did not know what it contained. What does it contain? Records, financial, operational. The kind of records that document how this family built what it built over decades, before the legitimate operations were large enough to stand on their own. A pause. Adrian knows where the archive is. He has always known. I told him when he turned 40 because I intended it as a form of inheritance, the family's complete history, including its difficult parts. Elara felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. A cold, specific shift. He's going to use it, she said. He believes that if he releases the archive to Ravel's legal team, they can use the historical records to argue that the Moretti family's legitimate operations, including Eastport, were built on foundations that compromise the current trust's legal standing. It would not destroy the trust, but it would create enough legal ambiguity to delay the federal proceeding by months, during which Ravel's creditor strategy could complete. Where is the archive? She asked. He took it this afternoon before I understood what he intended. He came to the house, and I thought he was coming to see me. We spoke for 20 minutes, and I didn't see it until he was leaving. He had it in his briefcase. Elara was quiet for a long moment. The car moved through evening traffic. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did at 6 in the evening, releasing its daytime population in waves, filling the sidewalks with people who were tired and going home to ordinary lives. She thought about what Matteo had told her. A second archive. Family records. The difficult parts of 3 decades of Moretti history. She thought about what Adrian would do with it. Not Ravel's legal team, that was the threat Matteo had relayed, but she didn't think it was the primary plan. Adrian was not a man who gave other people weapons to use on his behalf when he could use them himself. He was a man who believed in direct leverage, which meant he was going to use the archive as a negotiating instrument. Not with Ravel, with her. She understood this with the specific clarity that comes from having studied someone for 35 days and discovered that you had actually been studying them for 4 years without knowing it. He was going to come to her with the archive and offer her a choice. Abandon the federal cooperation, supports a civil resolution that protected him from the most serious charges, and in exchange he would not release material that could compromise the trust's legal standing and delay everything she had built. He was going to make her choose between Noah's future and 1,800 workers. He was going to do it because he believed she would choose Noah, because that was what he would do. Matteo, she said, where does Adrian go when he needs to think? Not his office. Not the house. Somewhere else. A pause. There is a property on the harbor. Pier 12. An old terminal facility the family has held for 20 years without developing. He used to go there when he was younger. I don't know if he still does. Is that where Ravel works from? A longer pause. I don't know, Matteo said very quietly. You should know, she said. You've been managing this for 3 years. You should have known. She ended the call. She sat in the moving car with the city moving past her and processed what she now understood. Adrian was at Pier 12, where, if Matteo's instinct was right and her instinct was right, and 35 days of studying a man was worth anything at all, Victor Ravel was also at Pier 12. And between them they had a physical archive of Moretti family records that represented 30 years of institutional vulnerability, and a plan to use it as leverage against the one person who had successfully dismantled everything they'd built. Called Alina. Adrian has taken a family document archive, she said, before Alina could speak. Historical records. He's going to use it as leverage. I need to know how much legal exposure does the trust have if historical operational records from 30 years ago are introduced into the federal proceeding. Alina's silence lasted long enough to tell her to see answer before the words did. It would depend on the records, Alina said carefully. If they document the kind of activity that typically precedes legitimate empire building in certain industries, the Trust's council would need time to establish the separation between historical operations and current legal standing. It wouldn't destroy the case against Ravel, but it could. How much time? 3 months. Possibly 5. 5 months. Long past the 10-day creditor window. Long past Ravel's ability to complete the Eastport acquisition through the secondary approach. "Where is the federal team right now?" she asked. "I can find out now, and tell them Pier 12. She paused. "Tell them it needs to be tonight." Alina went quiet. "Elara, if the federal team moves tonight and Adrian is there, I know. He won't just face the trust violation. He'll face—" "I know, Alina." Her voice was still even. The leveling was costing more than it had at any point in the past 35 days. She paid it. "Tell them Pier 12. Tonight." She ended the call. The car reached the penthouse building. She paid and got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cooling evening air. She had just done the thing she had been avoiding since day 1 of the 35 days. She had not been avoiding it because she didn't know it was coming. She had been avoiding naming it clearly, because naming it clearly meant sitting with what it cost. Adrian at Pier 12, with federal agents on their way, was not going to emerge from the night in the same legal position he currently occupied. The archive, the physical fact of it, the evidence of his deliberate plan to weaponize family history against her was, paradoxically, the thing that had forced her hand. If he had stayed away, if he had accepted the trustee decision and not moved to leverage historical records against the federal case, if he had not, even now, tried to find one more way to make her choose. But he had. He was who he was even now. She pressed her hand against her stomach. Noah had been quiet for most of the afternoon. He moved now, a slow, deep shift, the heavy roll of a baby in the final weeks before the body decides it is time. "I know," she said quietly. To both of them, she went inside. She was sitting in the kitchen at 9:43 p. The silver pen on the counter beside her second phone. When the pain arrived, not the dull, persistent ache of the 3rd trimester she had learned to carry, but something sharper, lower, with a rhythm to it that she recognized from the childbirth preparation materials she had read with the same methodical attention she gave everything. She checked her watch, checked again 7 minutes later. The rhythm was consistent. She picked up her phone and called her obstetrician's emergency line and described what she was experiencing with the same careful precision she had used in every conversation for the past 35 days. The doctor's voice was calm and immediate. "Go to the hospital now," she said. "Don't wait." Elara looked at the harbor, 34 weeks. 3 weeks early. She picked up the bag she had packed 6 days ago and left beside the bedroom door because she was the kind of woman who packed the hospital bag 6 days early and kept it where she could reach it because she had always known, that nothing in this story was going to arrive on schedule. She called a car. She did not call Adrian. She picked up the silver pen from the counter and held it for a moment, not sentimentally, just the automatic action of a hand reaching for something familiar, and then set it back down. Everything she had built over 35 days was now in motion without her direct management. The federal team was moving toward Pier 12. Alina had the archive location. The trustees had the evidence. And somewhere on the harbor, in an abandoned terminal that smelled like rust and salt water, 2 men were sitting with a briefcase full of records they thought could still save them, not understanding that the woman they had both underestimated in their different ways was no longer in the penthouse they had been planning around, but was instead in the back of a car, moving through the city at 9:51 p. 34 weeks pregnant, heading toward a hospital where her son was about to decide, on his own schedule and no one else's, that it was time. The car moved through the dark city. The harbor lights reflected on the water. Elara breathed through the next contraction and looked out the window and kept her hands flat on her knees, steady, the way they had been steady every time it mattered, because there was still more to get through, and she was still the person who had to get through it. And Noah was coming whether the rest of it was finished or not. The first contraction that made her grip the door handle came at 10:14 p. Somewhere on Atlantic Avenue, with the harbor sliding past the car window in long dark panels. Elara breathed through it the way the preparation materials had described, slow, measured the breath outlasting the pain, and when it released, she checked her watch and noted the duration, and went back to looking at the harbor. 7 minutes apart. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" "Drive faster," she said. He drove faster. Her phone rang at 10:19. "Alina. Federal team is at Pier 12, Alina said. Her voice had the compressed quality of someone relaying information in real time while receiving it. They made contact with the facility 20 minutes ago. There were 2 individuals present, we believe Ravel and at least 1 associate. Adrian's location is a pause. Adrian arrived at the facility approximately 40 minutes before the team. He's inside the archive. We don't know if he brought it to Ravel or if he still has it. The team is managing the entry. I don't have direct communication with them right now. Alina. Elara pressed her free hand flat against the seat beside her. I'm on my way to the hospital. The baby is coming. A silence that lasted about 2 seconds, which was, for Alina Voss, a very long silence. How far apart, Alina said. 7 minutes, moving. Okay. The word was calm and specific. I will handle what needs handling on this end. You handle what needs handling on yours. I will call you when I know more. Call me when you know about the archive. Elara, call me when you know. She ended the call. The hospital entrance appeared at 10:26. The driver pulled to the emergency drop-off, and she was out of the car before he fully stopped, bag over her shoulder, moving through the automatic doors with the deliberate pace of a woman who was not going to be rushed by anyone except the situation itself. The triage nurse took one look at her and said, How far apart? 6 minutes now. Come with me. They moved quickly through the corridor, not running, the nurse beside her, with a hand ready at her elbow that she didn't take, and into an examination room, where the sounds of the rest of the hospital became a lower frequency, something she could put behind her and focus past. The doctor arrived in 4 minutes. He was calm in the efficient way of people whose job requires them to be calm, regardless of what they're actually feeling. He reviewed her chart, asked 3 questions, placed his hand on her abdomen during the next contraction, and watched the monitor. 34 weeks, he said. Yes, his heart rate is good. Strong. He looked at the monitor. You're progressing. This is going to move. She had known it was going to move. She had known since the car. She lay in the hospital bed and breathed through the next contraction and held her phone and waited. At Pier 12, things were also moving. She knew this not because she could see it, but because she understood, with the specific precision of someone who had spent 35 days tracing the mechanics of other people's decisions, exactly what was happening in that abandoned terminal on the harbor. Victor Ravel had not survived 20 years of building his operation by being slow to respond to pressure. The moment Adrian walked through the door at Pier 12, Ravel would have read the situation: a man who had just lost his operational authority, who was carrying a briefcase and wearing the specific expression of someone who believed they still had one card to play, and Ravel would have made his own calculation. He needed the archive as much as Adrian needed to use it, maybe more. Because Ravel's secondary creditor strategy was legally exposed in ways his team had not fully resolved, and the Moretti family's historical records could provide a counter-narrative, a story of institutional corruption that cast the current trust violation as part of a pattern rather than an individual act of greed, and patterns were harder to prosecute cleanly than individual acts. So Ravel would have taken the briefcase, and Adrian, having handed over the one remaining leverage he possessed, would have found himself in a room with Victor Ravel and no exit position. She knew this because she knew Adrian, and she knew that the moment he walked into Pier 12, he had stopped being a man with a plan and become a man making a desperate move, and desperate moves in rooms with Victor Ravel ended in specific ways that she did not want to think about in detail. Her phone buzzed at 10:51. A number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local, and the call was insistent. 2 attempts within 30 seconds. She answered on the third, Ms. Moretti. A voice she didn't know. Male, controlled, with the particular flatness of federal law enforcement that she had heard that afternoon across a conference room table. I'm with the team at Pier 12. I need 60 seconds of your time. Talk. We have the facility contained. 3 individuals in custody: Ravel, 1 associate, and a woman we believe to be Sienna Ricci, who arrived approximately 30 minutes after our team established position. A brief pause. Your husband is also present. He is not in custody. He has the briefcase with the archive. He has barricaded himself in the facility's interior office with Ravel's associate, and he is currently refusing to open the door. She processed this in about 4 seconds. Why are you calling me? She asked. Because he asked us to. Another contraction arrived. She breathed through it slow, sustained, the breath doing the work, and when it passed, she said, he asked you to call his pregnant wife, who is currently in a hospital. He said. The agent paused, as if deciding how much of this to relay verbatim. He said you were the only person whose voice he would open the door for. The room was quiet except for the monitor. Noah's heartbeat was a steady rhythm on the screen beside her, fast, the way fetal heartbeats are fast, but strong and regular. The doctor had said strong. She held on to that. I need 5 minutes, she said. Ms. Moretti. 5 minutes. I'll call you back on this number. She ended the call. She lay in the hospital bed for a moment, with the phone on her chest, and looked at the ceiling. Adrian had the archive. He was in a barricaded room with Ravel's associate, which meant the associate was either a hostage, an ally, or a complication that had developed too fast for anyone outside the room to fully understand. He had called for her. Not his attorney, not his father. Her. The man who had signed divorce papers, believing he was winning. The man who had walked past her without touching her and laughed into a phone. The man who had said fine to the destruction of 1,800 people's livelihoods. He had asked them to call her. She called Alina first. He's barricaded at Pier 12, she said before Alina could speak. He has the archive. Federal team is outside the door. He's asking for me. You're in the hospital. I'm aware. Elara, you cannot leave. I'm not going to Pier 12. She kept her voice level. The falling cost more than it ever had before because the next contraction was building at the edge of her awareness, and she needed to get through the next 30 seconds before it arrived. I'm going to do what he asked, and I'm going to do it from this bed. What I need from you right now is to tell me whether the archive's content can be managed if he releases it. Can it be contained legally if it enters the federal proceeding? Our trust counsel reviewed the preliminary question this afternoon. The answer is yes, but it takes time and it complicates the 10-day window on the creditors. That's not good enough. The contraction arrived, and she breathed through it and kept her voice from breaking, which cost her more than everything else combined. When it passed, what happens to Eastport if the creditor window passes while the archive content is being managed? Alina was quiet for a moment. The workers lose their jobs. The terminal enters the distressed process. Ravel's acquisition vehicle is positioned to purchase. Even with Ravel in federal custody, his acquisition vehicle is a legal entity with its own standing. If the default is completed before the federal proceedings establish the conspiracy's scope, the vehicle can complete the purchase independently of Ravel's personal legal situation. There it was. Ravel had built it that way deliberately. He had built it so that even if he was arrested, even if the trust strategy failed, even if Adrian's participation was exposed, Eastport could still fall. His vehicle was a self-executing machine. The creditors were the trigger. The 10-day window was the clock. And the archive, if released into the federal proceeding, added enough legal ambiguity to delay the clock's management past 10 days. Which meant the only way to stop the machine was to stop the archive from becoming a weapon before the clock ran out. And the only person who could stop the archive was currently barricaded in a room at Pier 12, asking for her voice. She understood now why he had asked for her specifically. Not because he was sentimental, not because he was frightened, because he was the cleverest he had ever been. Right at the moment he had least to work with, and he had identified the one piece of leverage that remained to him. She needed him to release the archive. He knew she needed it, and he was going to make her ask. She called the federal agent back at 11:04. Put me through to him, she said. We don't have a direct line into them. Then get close enough to the door that he can hear my voice when I speak. I assume you have some form of communication with the room. A pause. Movement on the other end, footsteps. A door, the specific ambient sound of a large industrial space. Metal and concrete, and the smell she could almost imagine of salt water and rust. He can hear you, the agent said. She lay in the hospital bed and looked at the monitor beside her. Noah's heartbeat, fast and strong. Adrian, she said. Nothing for a moment. Then through the phone, muffled by the door and the industrial space between them, Elara. His voice sounded different. Not broken. Adrian Moretti did not break in ways that were audible. She had come to understand, but stripped of something. The particular performance layer that he maintained in every professional and domestic context had been removed, and what was left underneath was a voice she had heard maybe twice in 4 years, once when his younger brother died, and once when the first sonogram showed a heartbeat. I know what you're trying to do, she said. I know you know. It won't work, Adrian. Not because I don't care about the trust's legal position, because the creditor situation doesn't need the archive to complete. Ravel built the machine to run without him. A silence. Then why are you talking to me? He asked. Because you asked. Another silence. Longer. How far apart? He said. She closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. 5 minutes. You should be. I am where I need to be. The question is whether you're going to do what you came to Pier 12 to do, or whether you're going to open the door. If I open the door, I know what happens if you open the door, Elara. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. Not broke. Cracked the specific sound of pressure, finding the thinnest point. I need you to understand that I knew about Noah. I knew he was a beneficiary. I knew what the transfer meant for his Adrian. Stop, he stopped. I know you knew, she said. It's documented. The trustees have it. The federal team has it. She pressed her free hand against her sternum, where the breathing was getting harder. What I need from you right now is not an explanation. I need you to make one decision, and I need you to make it for the right reason. Because making it for the wrong reason won't hold, and you know it. What decision? Open the door and give them the archive. If I do that, I have nothing. No leverage. No, you have Noah. Her voice was even. She had made it even on purpose, and it cost her the most of anything she had said in 35 days. You will always have Noah. Whatever happens after tonight, whatever the federal proceeding determines, whatever the trust resolution looks like, whatever the next years of your life look like, you will always have access to your son, provided you do not make tonight worse than it already is. You can't promise. I don't make promises I can't keep. You know that about me. The next contraction was arriving. She could feel it building at the edges, the specific gathering pressure that preceded the wave. She had maybe 30 seconds. I am telling you clearly that destroying those workers to save yourself is not something I will forgive. And I am telling you equally clearly that what you do in the next 60 seconds is the first thing I will tell Noah when he is old enough to ask why his father is the man he became. The contraction arrived, and she could not speak through it, could not maintain the level voice she had been holding. She breathed through it in silence, pressing the phone against her ear, listening to the ambient industrial sounds of Pier 12 through the call. When it passed, she heard the door open, not dramatically, not with a statement. The sound was simply a latch releasing and hinges moving, and then the ambient sound changed, the echo expanded. The way sounds expand when a confined space opens into a larger one. The federal agent's voice, sir. Step toward me. Then nothing from Adrian. Then distant. Through the phone. She's in the hospital. His voice, speaking to the agent. Make sure sir. I need you to. She's in the hospital. He said again, louder. Someone needs to make sure she's. We know, the agent said. Step forward. The call ended. Elara lay in the hospital bed and breathed. The monitor beside her showed Noah's heartbeat still fast, still strong, the signal clear and consistent on the screen. Her doctor appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face, and then at the monitor, and then back at her face. We're going to move you, he said. It's time, I know, she said. She set the phone on the bedside table. She thought, the archive is with the federal team now. The creditor window is 10 days. Alina has what she needs. David has Eastport. The machine still exists, but it no longer has anyone to operate it. She thought, it's enough. What I've done is enough. It has to be enough, because I cannot do any more of it tonight. She let the nurses move her. The delivery suite was brighter than the examination room, and smaller than she expected. And there was a quality to it, the focused, organized quality of people who did this work every day, and understood that what happened in this room was separate from whatever had brought you to the building that she found, unexpectedly, close to a relief. The doctor said, on the next contraction, I want you to. She said, I know. I read the materials. He almost smiled. Of course you did. What happened over the next 2 hours was not the kind of thing that can be managed with documents or silver pens or 35 days of careful preparation. It was the kind of thing that operates entirely outside the systems she had built, purely physical, purely instinctive. The body making decisions that the mind had no access to and no authority over. She had always been slightly afraid of this part. Not of the pain was what it was, and she had accepted it, but of the loss of control. Of a situation in which her preparation was irrelevant, and the outcome was determined by biology rather than strategy. It turned out the loss of control was just another thing to breathe through. She breathed through it. At the same time she was breathing through it, at Pier 12, federal agents were processing the scene. Ravel was in custody. His associate was in custody. Cianchi was in custody, sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, and, by all accounts, asking to speak to a lawyer before her feet, had finished crossing the threshold. The briefcase with the Moretti family archive had been taken into evidence. Adrian was sitting on a concrete step outside the terminal with his coat around his shoulders and his hands in front of him, answering questions in the patient tone of a man who has decided that answering questions is the only remaining version of agency available to him. At 11:58 p.m., Ravel's legal team filed an emergency motion with the bankruptcy court clerk to advance the creditor acceleration timeline. The motion was reviewed at 12:23 a.m. by a duty judge who had been contacted by the federal prosecution team 40 minutes earlier and who denied the motion on grounds of the active federal proceeding. The 10-day window was suspended. The machine stopped. At 12:34 a.m., David Chen received a call from Alina. He was already awake, had been awake for hours, at his desk in Eastport's administrative building, with the light itsats on and the harbor outside his window. He listened to Alina for 4 minutes and then said, very quietly, it held. It held, Alina confirmed. At 2:47 a.m., in a delivery suite on the 3rd floor, Noah Moretti was born. He arrived 3 weeks early and slightly under 6 pounds, which the neonatal team handled with the calm efficiency of people who understood that early arrivals were simply a different kind of schedule. He was crying before Elara fully understood. He was there, a sound that cut through the room so absolutely that everything else in it, every other sound and sensation, and the particular accumulated weight of the past 35 days went quiet around it. The doctor said, "He's here." She heard him before she saw him. 3 full seconds of crying before the nurse brought him close enough, just close enough. A brief moment before the neonatal team needed him, and she saw his face. Red and furious and perfect in the specific way that only new things are perfect. Not because they're flossaplus, but because they're entirely themselves, with no performance layered over it yet, no management, no calculation. Just a person who had decided it was time. It took him to the neonatal team quickly. The separation lasted 40 seconds and felt longer. She tracked the movement of the blue cap. Someone had put a small blue cap on him, slightly too large, canted to one side until the team moved him past the edge of her sight line. She lay back. The room around her continued its organized activity, the medical team doing what medical teams do in the aftermath, methodical and calm. She looked at the ceiling. She had 35 days of sustained high-stakes management behind her, and a body that had just done the most demanding physical work of her life, and she was lying in a delivery suite at 2:51 a.m. while her son was being assessed in the neonatal unit, and her husband was sitting on a concrete step at a federal crime scene. And somewhere in the city, Alina was still awake, managing the archive's legal implications. In Eastport Terminal's 1,800 workers were sleeping, without knowing that the machine that had been aimed at their livelihoods had stopped moving 47 minutes ago. She closed her eyes. She was not peaceful, she was not resolved. She was not any of the things she thought she might feel when this moment arrived. She was exhausted in a way that went past tired into something more like the specific emptiness that follows a long, sustained effort, the particular quiet that isn't rest yet, but is the first territory on the road to it. She thought about the silver pen on the penthouse counter. She thought about Noah's face. She thought about the blue cap, slightly too large, canted to one side. The doctor said softly, "We're going to let you rest." "How is he?" she asked. She did not open her eyes. "Strong," the doctor said. "He's going to need some time in the neonatal unit, but strong." She had known he would be strong. She had known it since the first morning she sat at the kitchen island with the divorce papers, and her hand did not shake. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and stayed there in the specific suspended moment between everything that had just happened and whatever came next. In the quiet before the rest of it began the legal proceedings, the federal case, the trust restructuring, the long, careful work of building something that would hold, and she let the moment be exactly what it was, without managing it, without filing it, without making it useful. Just a woman, in a room at 2:53 a, whose son had just decided it was time. And outside the hospital, in the cooling harbor air of a Boston night, Adrian Moretti sat on a concrete step at Pier 12 and looked at the water and said nothing to anyone. Because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already in the briefcase the federal agents had carried past him, and nothing left to do that wasn't going to have to be done in a courtroom, and nothing left to protect, except the one thing he had signed away in a penthouse kitchen, and then, hours later, in an industrial doorway, chosen not to destroy. The harbor was very still. The water held the lights of the city, the way water always does, broken, shifting, never quite the same shape twice, and somewhere across it, in a hospital room 3 floors up, a woman who had spent 35 days dismantling an empire with a silver pen and a 31-day head start was lying in the dark with her eyes open, listening for the sound of her son. Noah spent 18 days in the neonatal intensive care unit. Elara learned those 18 days the way she had learned most things in her life, through sustained attention and a willingness to sit with discomfort until it became familiar. The unit had its own language, oxygen saturation numbers, feeding volumes measured in milliliters, the specific meaning of each alarm tone, and which ones required immediate action versus which ones were the ordinary noise of small bodies working hard to regulate themselves. She learned the language within 3 days. By day 5, she could read the monitor at a glance and know without asking the nurses whether what she was seeing was progress or a setback. It was mostly progress, slow, incremental, unmistakable. Noah gained weight in the particular way of premature infants, not steadily, but in small surges followed by plateaus that felt. To a mother sitting beside an isolette for 6 hours a day, like the whole process had stalled. The nurses told her the plateaus were normal. She believed them intellectually and sat with the worry anyway, because believing something intellectually and being free of it are different experiences, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. She held him for the first time on day 3. A nurse placed him against her chest skin to skin, his entire body fitting into the space between her collarbone and her sternum, his weight barely registering as physical weight and registering enormously as everything else. And she sat very still for 47 minutes and said nothing. She did not cry. She had expected to cry. She had, in the detached way she sometimes examined her own emotional predictions, been slightly curious about it, whether she would cry, and when, and what it would feel like to cry, after 35 days of sustained compression. It didn't happen on day 3, or day 5, or in the first week at all. It happened on day 9, when a nurse named Patricia told her that Noah had gone 4 consecutive hours maintaining his own body temperature without the isolette's supplemental heat. Elara sat in the plastic chair beside the unit bed and cried for about 6 minutes. Patricia handed her a tissue and didn't say anything, which was the right response. She wiped her face and looked at Noah, who was oblivious, as neonates are oblivious, occupied entirely with the work of existing, and she filed the moment away, not under grief or relief, but under something she didn't have a clean category for. Something adjacent to gratitude but sharper, the specific feeling of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set a small piece of it down. The legal proceedings began while Noah was still in the neonatal unit, because legal proceedings do not pause for neonatal units. Alina managed the trust restructuring with the same methodical efficiency she had brought to every step of the past 5 weeks. The independent trustees confirmed their permanent administrative structure. David Chen's operational authority at Eastport was formalized through a board resolution that removed any remaining ambiguity about the chain of command. The $8 million remained in the Legacy Trust's primary reserve account, its intended path permanently blocked, and the Trust's independent counsel began the process of establishing ironclad separation between the current legal structure and the historical operational records that Adrian had attempted to weaponize. The archive, it turned out, was both more and less than Matteo had feared. More because its records were genuine, the Moretti family had built its early empire through the particular combination of legitimate industry and organized influence that characterized certain American businesses of a certain era, and the archive documented that history with the unsentimental completeness of records kept by people who believed, at the time of keeping them, that no one outside the family would ever read them. Less because the historical records, on review by both the Trust's independent counsel and the federal prosecution team, predated Eastport's establishment by nearly a decade. The terminal had been built legitimately, operated legitimately, and employed its 1,800 people through a structure that the archive's contents could complicate but could not ultimately compromise. The legal work to establish that separation took 11 weeks and cost the Trust's legal defense fund a significant sum, but it held. The machine stopped and it stayed stopped. Victor Ravel's federal trial was set for the following spring. The prosecution's case was, by any reasonable assessment, overwhelming. 18 months of communications records. The forensic financial trace Alina's team had built. The Pier 12 recording that federal surveillance had captured during the team's approach to the facility cleaner than Elara's own service corridor recording, which remained in the evidence package as a corroborating document. And Sienna Fricci, who had called her attorney from the federal vehicle at Pier 12 and, within 48 hours of her initial interview, made the calculation Elara had anticipated. Cooperation was the difference between a federal deuce conspiracy charge and a reduced civil exposure. Sienna's testimony, when it came, was specific and detailed, and told the federal investigators things about Ravel's operation that they had suspected for 18 months without being able to confirm. She knew more than she had told Elara in the penthouse study. She had known more, Elara concluded, than she had admitted to knowing in that room, and had been calculating, even in that frightened, stripped-down version of herself, what to disclose and what to hold back. Elara couldn't fault the calculation. She had done the same thing herself in different rooms. Ravel was convicted on 11 federal counts. He received 22 years. His acquisition vehicle, without his management, and with its legal strategy, dismantled by the federal proceeding, dissolved without completing any transaction. Eastport Terminal remained operational under David Chen's authority through the entirety of the legal proceedings and beyond. The 1,800 workers kept their jobs. Most of them never knew how close they had come to losing them. Adrian's federal case was handled separately, as the prosecution had determined early that his cooperation value was significant enough to justify a distinct proceeding. He had, in the room at Pier 12, made a choice that the federal team acknowledged in the formal record. He had provided a documented archive that was ultimately more useful to the prosecution than to the defense, and he had opened the door. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement over 3 months of careful work. Adrian admitted his role in the financial conspiracy, acknowledged the misuse of protected trust assets, and paid full restitution of the amounts that had been moved, including the household funds, the Back Bay apartment expenditures, and the preliminary transaction amounts that had cleared before the freeze. His operational authority was permanently removed. His access to the legacy trust in any administrative capacity was permanently revoked. His federal sentence was 4 years, with eligibility for supervised release at 18 months, given the documented cooperation. He reported to the federal facility in March. Before he did, he came to the neonatal unit. It was day 12. Elara had been there since 7 in the morning. She was in the plastic chair beside Noah's unit bed, reading a financial brief on her phone. She had been managing the trust's restructuring documents from the unit for a week. Because the work didn't stop, and the hospital had reasonable Wi-Fi, when she heard footsteps she recognized at the unit entrance. She did not look up immediately. She had known he would come. She had been deciding for 4 days what she would do when he did. She looked up when he reached the edge of the unit. He was dressed plainly, a gray coat she didn't recognize, dark trousers, no tie. He had lost weight in the weeks since Pier 12, not dramatically but visibly. In the stress and sleep deprivation and the sustained experience of consequences removed the surface padding that comfortable lives accumulate. He looked like a version of the man she had married that had been put through something and come out the other side with less of the performance intact. He looked at Noah, not at her. At Noah. The baby was asleep, which he was most of the time at day 12, doing the metabolic work that neonates do in sleep. He was wearing a white onesie, slightly too large for him, and the blue cap that had been replaced by a properly fitting one on day 2. One hand was raised beside his face, fist loosely closed. Adrian stood at the edge of the unit for a long moment. "He's smaller than I expected," he said finally. "He's getting bigger." She set her phone down. "He held his own temperature for 4 hours yesterday." Adrian nodded. He kept looking at Noah. He stopped. "Sit down," she said. He pulled a chair from the wall and sat at the opposite side of the unit bed. The bed was narrow enough that he and Elara were perhaps 4 feet apart. He did not look at her for a moment. He looked at his son. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "That would be a change," she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. He absorbed it. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you. For weeks. I've written things down and thrown them away." He looked at his hands. "Everything I come up with sounds like an excuse. Then don't start with an explanation." He was quiet. "Start with what you actually feel," she said. "Not what you think I want to hear. Not what makes the picture better. What you actually feel." He looked at Noah. "I feel like I wasted 4 years," he said, "of your life. Of what we could have." He stopped. "And I feel like I am not capable of understanding the full weight of that. I can say the words, but I don't know if I can feel them the way you need me to feel them. And that might be the most honest thing I've ever told you." She held that for a moment. "It is," she said. "I knew about Noah," he said. "The trust, the transfer. I knew he was listed. I told myself the money would come back around, that it was temporary, that Ravel's plan would complete, and there would be more than enough, and Noah would never know the difference." He pressed his hands flat on his knees. "I knew the 1,800 workers. I knew their names. I knew the payroll reports because I signed off on them every quarter. And I said, fine, I know. There is no version of that I can make acceptable." "No," she agreed. "There isn't." Noah made a small sound in his sleep, not a cry. more of a compressed sound of a person settling, and both of them looked at him, and the room was quiet for a moment around that small sound. "What do I do?" Adrian asked. He said it without the calculation she had learned to identify in his voice over 4 years. He said it like a man who had run out of strategies and was asking a genuine question. "You're going to report in March," she said, "and you're going to serve what you owe, and you're going to do it without using Noah as a reason to avoid it or reduce it. Because the sentence is not something I will intercede in, and you should not expect me to. I know. When you come out, you're going to be a different version of what you are right now. I don't know what version, neither do you." She looked at him steadily. "Noah will be 2 years old. He won't remember this period. What he'll remember is whatever comes after. And you'll let me? I will not keep you from your son unless you give me reason to." She said it clearly, without warmth and without coldness, the way she said things that were true and important. "But I will not manage his access to you. I will not prepare him for disappointment on your behalf. I'll not explain you to him in ways that make you more than you are. He'll have to understand you the way everyone has to understand people. They love gradually, imperfectly, and with room for the full accounting." Adrian looked at her. "That's fair," he said. "It's not about fair," she said. "It's about what's true." He nodded slowly. They sat on opposite sides of the unit bed for another 20 minutes, not speaking much, watching Noah sleep. At some point, a nurse came in to check the monitors and made the small adjustments that nurses make, and left again without comment. The unit had its own rhythm of attention and withdrawal, and the two of them fit into it without disrupting it. When Adrian stood to leave, he paused at the edge of the unit. "The archive," he said. "The family records. I want you to know that when I took it from my father's house, I intended to use it the way I told him I intended to use it. It wasn't a bluff, I know. But in the room at Pier 12, with Ravel, he took the briefcase and he looked at the records and he said," Adrian stopped. He said the records made Adrian Moretti exactly who he always knew he was. And he laughed. She waited. "And I thought about the crane operators," Adrian said, "on the payroll reports. I had a name in my head, Raymond Kowalski, 23 years at the terminal. I'd seen the report every quarter for 6 years. And I thought, Raymond Kowalski didn't build this empire, and he didn't make these choices, and he is sleeping tonight without knowing his name is in a briefcase, in a room with Victor Ravel." He looked at his hands again. "And I called the agents, and I told them to call you." "I know why you called me," she said. "I know you do." He met her eyes. "I needed it to be your voice. Not because I thought it would save me. Because you were the only person who would tell me the truth about what I was doing." She looked at him. "Go home, Adrian," she said quietly. "Get ready for March, and come see Noah before you go." He left. She sat with Noah for another 3 hours, before the nurse suggested gently that she go home and sleep. She went home. The penthouse was the same and entirely different. The way places become when the context surrounding them has changed completely, while the physical details haven't moved. The marble island. The harbor beyond the window. The silver pen on the counter where she had left it the night Noah was born. She stood at the island for a moment. She picked up the pen, turned it in her hand, set it back down. She had a lot of work left. The trust restructuring was 3 months from completion. The independent board's formation required her personal involvement in 8 more formal proceedings. The Eastport Worker and Family Protection Fund, her initiative, proposed to the trustees in week 2 of the neonatal unit stay, approved unanimously, was in its organizational phase, and needed its founding documents finalized. She had a meeting with David Chen on Thursday. She had a call with the Trust's independent counsel on Friday. She had somewhere in the next 2 weeks to begin the work of finding a new apartment, something smaller, something that was hers rather than a Moretti family asset, and arranging Noah's transition from the neonatal unit to whatever came next. She had enough work for several months, and a body that needed sleep, and a son who needed her to still be standing when he came home. She went to bed. She slept 7 hours without interruption, which was the most she had slept in 35 days plus 18 neonatal unit days. And when she woke, the harbor was gray and early, and the city was making its ordinary morning sounds. She lay in bed for a moment before getting up. She was not happy, exactly. She was not the version of resolved that exists in stories where the resolution feels complete because the narrative ends at the right moment. She was the actual version, tired, slightly sore in her lower back from the plastic neonatal unit chair, aware of the legal calls she needed to return, and the trust documents she needed to review, and the enormous, ordinary work of a life that had been restructured from the ground up and now needed to be lived. She got up. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen island with the tea and the silver pen and the harbor beyond the window, and she thought about everything she had built in the past 35 days, plus the time that followed, and she thought about what it was going to cost to build what came next, and she thought about Noah's face on day 3 when she held him against her chest. She drank the tea. She picked up her phone and called Alina. "How's he doing?" Alina asked before Elara could speak. "Strong," she said. "He's getting stronger every day." "And you?" "Working on it." She set down the tea. "I want to talk about the fund's founding documents. I've been thinking about the scope. I want the protection to extend to workers' families, not just direct employees. Educational support, healthcare supplement, something that actually holds when a family has a bad year. That's a significant budget expansion from the initial proposal." "I know. Let's find the budget." She picked up the pen. "The trust has enough. We can afford to be generous." A pause. "Okay," Alina said. "I'll have the revised scope on your desk by Thursday." They talked for 30 minutes about the fund, about the trust's structure, about the independent board's first formal session, scheduled for the following week. Elara took notes in the margin of a legal pad she kept on the kitchen counter, specific, numbered, cross-referenced, and when the call ended, she reviewed the notes and organized them into action items by deadline. Then she went to the hospital. Noah was awake when she arrived. He was doing that thing he had started doing in the past 2 days, tracking movement, his eyes following the nurses across the unit with the determined, slightly unfocused attention of a new person learning that the world contained things other than warmth and sleep. The nurse told her he'd fed well at the 6 a.m. check. She sat beside him and let him track her face for a while. "We have work to do," she told him. He tracked her face. "The fund needs its founding documents. The board needs its organizational structure. We need to find an apartment." She reached into the unit and let him close his hand around her index finger. His grip was already stronger than it had been at day 3. "I'm going to need you to cooperate with the schedule." He gripped her finger. She stayed for 4 hours. The next several weeks moved the way difficult periods move when you are inside them, not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of density that makes each day feel like it contains more material than a day ordinarily holds. Noah came home on day 18. Not to the penthouse. She had found the apartment by day 15, a smaller place on the other side of the harbor, with a view of the water and rooms that were the right size, and nothing in them that was a Moretti family asset. She brought him home in a car seat slightly too large for his current size, and a blue knit hat that Patricia from the neonatal unit had given her when she said goodbye. The apartment was quiet and clean and entirely hers. She set the car seat on the living room floor and crouched beside it and looked at her son for a long moment. He was asleep. He was almost always asleep in those first weeks at home, when the work of eating and growing consumed most of his available capacity, and the world outside the neonatal unit was still a loud and poorly calibrated place. She watched him breathe, in out, the small chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of a body that had worked very hard to regulate itself and had succeeded. She stayed crouched beside him until her knees protested, and then she sat cross-legged on the floor instead. She did not have a lot of quiet moments in the weeks that followed. The fund's founding documents were finalized in the second week of Noah's homecoming. The independent board held its first formal session, during which Elara participated as Noah's protective representative and as a founding donor to the Worker and Family Fund, and then formally submitted her resignation from the representative role with a written statement that the board's independent structure was sufficiently established to no longer require a Moretti family member in an oversight function. The board accepted the resignation. She walked out of that session and into the gray Boston afternoon and stood on the sidewalk outside Alina's building for a moment, letting the cold air move through her. She had spent 3 months building a structure designed to operate without her. It was operating without her. She went home and fed Noah and called Petra and talked for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. And Petra asked her how she was doing in the way that means the real question. And Elara said she was doing something that wasn't quite okay and wasn't quite not okay, and was probably the accurate version of what recovery from something like this actually feels like. "That sounds right," Petra said. "I thought I'd feel more resolved. You dissolved a Mafia empire and gave birth prematurely in the same week. Give yourself 6 months." "The empire dissolved itself," Elara said. "I just documented it." "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Reducing what you did." Petra's voice was the specific directness of someone who has known you for long enough to say the thing. "You sat in a concrete corridor at 33 weeks pregnant and recorded 2 men planning to destroy 1,800 people's jobs. You built the entire legal structure from inside the marriage while maintaining the appearance of a compliant wife. You convinced a mafia boss to open a door and give himself to federal agents. A pause. Take credit for what you did. Elara was quiet for a moment. I'm learning, she said. She was. The months that followed were ordinary in the way that life after extraordinary things becomes ordinary, not because the weight disappears, but because the daily requirements of a real life don't accommodate sustained drama. Noah ate and slept and grew and began, somewhere in his 3rd month, to smile not the reflexive early smiles, but the actual ones, the ones where he looked at her face and responded to it as the face of a specific person he recognized and was glad to see. She found that smile nearly impossible to describe, and she was usually good at descriptions. Matteo called once a month. She took the calls. They were brief and specific, covering trust matters and Noah's development and very little else. She had not forgiven him in the way that forgiveness sometimes means the erasure of what someone did. She had reached a position that was more like a clear-eyed accounting. She understood what he had done, understood why he had done it, and understood that he was an old man who had spent 60 years prioritizing institutions over individuals and was now too late recalibrating. She did not hate him. She did not trust him fully. She kept the calls brief and specific, and that was enough. In the spring, 2 months before Adrian's anticipated supervised release date, she received a formal letter from his attorney outlining a proposed visitation structure for when he returned. She reviewed it with her own counsel, a family law attorney she had retained independently, someone with no Moretti connection, and she suggested 3 modifications, all of which the other side accepted. The structure was clear. Supervised visits initially in a neutral location. A graduated increase in frequency and length tied to demonstrated consistency rather than to any petition or negotiated timeline. Noah's comfort and signals as the primary determining factor, assessed by a child development professional she selected. She sent the counter-proposal back and did not hear from the other side for 2 weeks. Then Adrian's attorney confirmed the agreement. Adrian was released on supervised parole in June, 14 months after Pier 12. He came for his first supervised visit on a Saturday morning. A park near the harbor, which she had chosen because it was familiar and open, and had a specific maple tree near the water that she liked for no particular reason she could articulate. She arrived with Noah in the carrier, which Noah still tolerated at 14 months, though he was increasingly opinionated about the direction he wanted to face. She got him settled, facing outward toward the water, and sat on the bench beneath the maple tree and waited. Adrian arrived on time. She noted this not as a point in his favor exactly, but as information. He was different in the ways she had expected, and different in ways she hadn't. He was thinner than he'd been at the neonatal unit. He moved differently, not with the managed casualness of a man performing ease, but with something more like actual ease, or the early stages of it, a man who had spent 14 months in an environment that stripped performance away and was now slowly finding out what was underneath. He wore a plain coat, no watch, no ring. He stopped about 10 feet away from the bench and looked at Noah. Noah looked at him. At 14 months, Noah had opinions about people. He was not a baby who was charmed by every stranger. He required a period of assessment, which he conducted with the focused seriousness of someone who had already decided that the world was more complicated than it initially appeared. He looked at Adrian with this expression now. Adrian crouched down to his level, which was the right instinct. He didn't reach out. He didn't make sounds designed to charm. He just went down to the child's eye level and waited. Noah looked at him. Then Noah held out the blue toy truck he'd been clutching since they left the apartment. It was battered. He'd dropped it on concrete twice in the past month, and the front left wheel was stuck, which Noah had been communicating his displeasure about through a series of increasingly pointed grunts. Adrian took the truck carefully. He looked at the wheel. He sat down on the path, right there. On the path, in his plain coat, without apparent concern for the coat, and turned the truck over in his hands and looked at the wheel mechanism. It's stuck, he said. Noah said with great authority, stuck. I see that. Adrian pressed the wheel carefully, testing its resistance. He looked at Elara. Is there anything? She reached into the bag and produced a small multi-tool she had brought precisely because Noah had been communicating about the wheel for 4 days. Adrian took it. He opened the small flathead. He worked the wheel's axle carefully for about 3 minutes, which was 3 minutes of complete silence, broken only by the harbor sounds and Noah's close attention. The wheel turned. Noah made a sound of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Adrian handed the truck back. Noah took it and ran the specific, unsteady, determined run of a 14-month-old who has somewhere very important to be toward the path beside the water. Elara watched him go. She tracked him at the distance she had learned to hold, close enough to move if needed, far enough to let him discover the path on his own terms. Adrian sat on the path for a moment longer. Then he stood and came to sit on the far end of the bench. They watched Noah for a while in silence. "He's good," Adrian said. "He is. He stopped. He has his own face," she said. "I've decided not to see other faces in it." A short silence. "That's probably wise," he said. She looked at him. He was watching Noah with an expression she had seen exactly once before at the sonogram, when he had been genuinely moved in a way that was entirely real. It was on his face now, unmanaged, the way it had been then. She filed it under true things. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to hear it as information, not as a reward." He turned slightly toward her. "What you did at Pier 12, opening the door, giving them the archive." She looked at Noah, who had stopped by the water's edge and was examining something on the path with great interest. It mattered. Not to the case we had enough without the archive, and you should know that. But it mattered because you did it for the right reason, or close to the right reason. And that's not something I'm going to pretend I didn't notice. He was quiet. "Why are you telling me that?" he asked. "Because you're going to spend the next several years wondering whether any of it counted, whether there's any version of who you were that was worth anything." She turned to look at him directly. One decision at the right moment, for the right reason, doesn't fix what came before it, but it's real. It goes in the accounting. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. He looked at his hands, then at Noah. "What do I do with that?" he asked. "You build from it," she said. "One ordinary day at a time. That's all there is." Noah had found whatever he was examining on the path a stone, it looked like, a particular stone that had caught his attention, and he held it up toward the water with the specific gesture of someone presenting evidence. The harbor received this information without comment. "Adriano," Noah announced to no one and everyone, and ran back toward the bench with the stone held aloft. Adrian stood from the bench and went down on one knee when Noah reached him, and Noah placed the stone in his hand with great ceremony. Adrian held it. It was an ordinary stone, smooth gray the size of his thumbnail, the kind of thing the harbor deposited in thousands every day on every path near the water. He looked at it as if it were something else. Noah watched to make sure the stone had been properly received, then turned and ran back toward the water. Adrian held the stone and did not try to follow. He watched his son run and did not call him back, and did not pull him close, and did not claim the moment as something it wasn't. He just watched. Elara watched too, from beneath the maple tree, with the harbor beyond, and the morning moving through its ordinary paces, and Noah's laughter carrying back to them on the water air, clear and uncomplicated. The laughter of a person who has not yet learned to hold anything back. She did not feel resolved. She felt something more like the early stages of it, the territory where the weight is still present, but has shifted from acute to chronic. And chronic was something she knew how to carry. She had not restored what was broken. She had not forgiven what was unforgivable. She had not replaced one thing with another, and called it healing. She had built something from the actual material available, imperfect people, difficult history, legal structure designed to outlast the mistakes that had made it necessary. And she was sitting beneath a maple tree on a Saturday morning, watching her son present evidence to his father, and the harbor was exactly what it had always been. And the silver pen was at home on her kitchen counter where she had left it, and she was here. It was enough. She had decided more than enough. It was hers.